Xilonen is a new Geo 5-star from Natlan. She seems really good at doing what she was intended to do. Her entire kit scales with her defense, so keep that in mind while building her. So with all of that in mind, let's break down what she does first. In Night Soul mode, Xilonen has Geo-infused normal attacks, but she can't use her charged attack. Using her elemental skill makes Xilonen perform a dash, dealing Geo damage. She then gains 45 Night Soul points and enters Night Soul state, increasing her movement speed and climbing speed. She also transforms into an ocelot when you click your jump button while climbing, going really fast for a split second. In Night Soul state, she will gain 3 Geo Source sample to start with. This source samples will each change to your other team member's element, but only from Pyro, Electro, Hydro, and Cryo. Her Night Soul state has a duration limit of 9 seconds, of which after 9 seconds has passed, her Night Soul points will immediately expire, and you cannot get any more points from her passive. When her Night Soul points reaches max from her passive Netto to Lisley's Echoes, all of her source sample will be activated. When the source samples are active, nearby opponents' corresponding elemental resistance will decrease. So an activated Pyro sample will decrease opponents' Pyro resistance, and so on. The effect of multiple source sample of the same elements will not stack. This effect still exists even when Xilonen is off-field. This resistance shred also scales with her skill level, and goes up to 36% at level 10, which is a lot higher compared to Zhongli's shield, that is a flat 20% decrease on all level. Her first ascension passive, Netto to Lisley's Echoes, gives extra effect when she's in her Night Soul state. This passive is the most important part of her kit. If Xilonen has at least 2 source samples changed to any of the 4 basic elements, she gains 35 Night Soul points when her normal or plunging attacks hit opponents. This is the only way to get her Night Soul points to max. But if Xilonen has less than 2 source samples changed, her normal and plunging attacks deal 30% increased damage. Next, her second ascension passive. While in the Night Soul's Blessing state, when Xilonen's Night Soul points reach the maximum, she will trigger a similar effect as a Night Soul burst. This effect can synergize with other Natlan character that gets a damage stack from Night Soul burst and the 2-piece scroll, but can only be triggered once every 14 seconds. Additionally, when a Night Soul burst is triggered, Xilonen's defense is increased by 20% for 15 seconds. Her other passives are strictly for if you're in Natlan. First, when triggering Night Soul transmission, she recovers 15 phlogiston. Second, in Natlan specifically, she can trigger Night Soul transmission when you switch to Xilonen, while the active character is currently sprinting, climbing, in a movement mode caused by certain talents, or at a certain height in the air. Triggering her Night Soul transmission makes Xilonen enter Night Soul state with a time limit of 4 seconds. But you can press her skill within those 4 seconds to extend the duration by 9 seconds. Additionally, while in Natlan and in the Night Soul's Blessing state, Xilonen will not consume stamina when climbing. With 60 energy, you can use her burst to deal a decent amount of geo damage around her. Then the burst will do different things depending on her current source sample, similar to her first ascension passive. If Xilonen has at least 2 source samples changed, her burst will heal nearby party members at an interval, lasting for 12 seconds. This heal scales of her defense as well, making her the second defense healer in the game after Noelle. But if Xilonen has less than 2 source samples changed, her burst will deal 2 additional instances of damage, doing the same damage as the original hit. She deals around 500% of her defense for each instance of her burst damage, so her burst will be doing around 1500% of her defense this way. From her kit, there are 2 ways to play Xilonen, either as a healer and debuffer support or as an on-field Geo DPS. Both are viable options. Playing her as a support makes her a more flexible character, but she's also able to be a good enough Geo on-field DPS. For her skill priority, if you intend to use her as a support, you should focus her elemental skill first, then her elemental burst, then her normal attacks last. But if you want to play her as a DPS, focus on her normal attacks first, then her elemental burst, then her elemental skill last. Her artifact options will depend on what you're playing her as. Let's start with support artifacts first. 4-piece scroll will be your best option by far, a set that synergizes the most with Xilonen, giving more than 3 times the amount of damage bonus compared to a non-Natlan character. You can also use 4-piece noblesse to give an attack increase to your whole team, if you don't have another character in your team using it. 4-piece husk can give you some more defense percent. You can also use 2-piece husk and 2-piece scroll. Or alternatively, you can use 4-piece Song of Days Past to convert her heals to a damage increase. I haven't tested out the 4-piece Song of Days yet, but it's definitely way less of a buff than the other sets I've mentioned before. Main stats you should look for is energy recharge on the sands, and defense on both Goblet and Circlet. Then, the sub-stats you should look for are defense percent, energy recharge, and flat defense. But as a support, you should prioritize the set bonus over the main stats, especially for the 4-piece scroll. This 4-piece set bonus is something you must have on support Xilonen. Next up, if you're planning to use her as a DPS, 4-piece husk or 4-piece obsidian codex will be your best options. The main stat you should look for is defense percent on the sands, geo damage bonus on the goblet, and crit damage or crit rate on the circlet. Substats-wise, you should look for crit damage, crit rate, and defense. As a main DPS, you should prioritize her artifact stats over the set bonus. So if you can't get a 4-piece set with good stats, you can use any combination of 2-piece sets, like Husk of Opulent Dreams, Archaic Petra, Marechaussee Hunter, and Obsidian Codex. Alternatively, you can also use the 4-piece Gladiator, though keep in mind that the 2-piece bonus will be completely useless. Xilonen's weapon options will also depend on what you play her as. Though there is one weapon that'll work the best with both playstyle she has, which is her signature weapon, Peak Patrol Song. This weapon gives everything she needs as a support and as a DPS. She has other alternatives, of course, but they won't be as versatile as her signature weapon. For support, you can use Flute of Ezpitzal, the Natlan craftable sword, Favonius Sword for extra energy for the team, or Cinnabar Spindle for the defense stat. If you've just started playing the game, you can use the Traveler's Handy Sword, which gives defense percent. For DPS though, her weapon alternatives are Uraku Misugiri. Chiori's signature weapon buffs her defense and give damage bonus on normal attack. Mist Splitter reforged for an increased damage on infused normal attacks, or Flute of Ezpitzal. Alternatively, you can use Harbinger of Dawn if you don't have anything else. Your team composition will also decide whether she will be a support or a DPS. You need to have at least 2 of the basic elements, Pyro, Electro, Hydro, Cryo, in your team to have her as a support. Less than that, she will only be useful as an on-field DPS. Also, if you're using her as an on-field DPS, a mono Geo team will be your best option. Xilonen as a support works with any team, except for Anemo and Dendro-focused teams. For example, you can put her in an Arlecchino team, with Arlecchino, Bennett, a Hydro or Anemo, and Xilonen as support. You can also put her with Mualani, since Xilonen triggers an extra Night Soul burst. With Mualani, Xiangling, Farina, and Xilonen as an example. As an on-field DPS, your best option is no doubt a mono Geo team. This team generally consists of Xilonen as the main DPS, a sub-DPS like Chiori, Albedo, or Kachina with 4-piece scroll. Then a Geo buffer like Goru or Yunjin. Lastly, a sustain character's healer or shielder. You'll need a sustain due to Xilonen losing her ability to heal as a main DPS. Some example for the 4th slot are Zhongli, Noelle, or Xianyun if you want to do a plunge DPS Xilonen. Other sustain characters can be used if you don't have any of these. Xilonen's team rotation also depends on what you play her as. As a support, you only need around 3 seconds on-field time for her. All you need to do is swap to her, use her elemental skill, normal attack until her Night Soul points are maxed. After that, you can switch to another character. You can use her burst anytime in your rotation, whenever you need heals, since you don't need to use your skill first for the burst to count your source sample. Also, before swapping to her, make sure the enemies has an element applied to them, preferably your main DPS's element, to activate the 4-piece scroll effect. As an on-field DPS in a mono-geo team, you can treat her as a hyper carry. Use all of your other characters' abilities and buffs first. Then swap to Xilonen, use her burst, use her skill, then just spam your normal attacks. If you're trying to play a plunge DPS Xilonen with Xianyun, then you should burst with Xianyun just before swapping to Xilonen. Xilonen stands as a character with the most unique kit so far, being able to swap between 2 different roles depending on what team she's placed in. And this is not locked behind Constellation like Kazuha and Farina on their C6, for example. Don't get me wrong though, her constellations are nothing to laugh at, especially with how broken her C2 and C6 are. But all of those constellation improves both her support and DPS potential, without locking behind any of these roles. So you don't need to feel forced to pull for her constellation at all. I recommend pulling for her if you have the Primo Gems. She will definitely give a lot of value to most team compositions. Though as always, if you have someone you like more than Xilonen, then feel free to skip her and get who you want the most. That's all. Cheers!